मेरा जो अपना विषय है वो इंडोनेशिया है, साउथ ईस्ट एशिया है। वहाँ पर जो है इसको एक टर्म दिया है इंडिक बेल्ट। इसको कि एक बृहद भारत के रूप में हम देख सकते हैं और उस पे मैंने कोशिश किया है और बहुत सारी चीज़ें उन्होंने कही है, बहुत अच्छी-अच्छी चीज़ें कही है उन्होंने कि बोध गया को हम लिंक कैसे करें और इस लिंकेजेस के अंदर जो है कितनी सारे रोड ब्लॉक्स हैं, कितनी सारी चीज़ें हैं जहाँ हमें देखना पड़ेगा। हम उसको मक्का या किसी और तरीके से नहीं देख सकते। हाँ, लेकिन उस बोध गया की स्थिति जहाँ पर है, उसको जो हमारे पास बुद्धिज़्म का और हिंदुइज़्म का जहाँ-जहाँ धरोहर है, जो कहीं-कहीं न कहीं पर अपनी मौलिक अवस्था में है, उसको लिंक करने के लिए हम कितने प्रयास करेंगे। लिंकेजेस का मतलब उन्होंने बहुत सारी चीज़ें बहुत ही सुगम तरीके से कहा कि जब हम बोध गया स्टेशन पर उतरते हैं, तो सबसे पहले जो इट इज़ लाइक असॉल्ट। एक भारतीय होने के नाते से व्हेन आई फील असॉल्टेड, तो एक जापानीज़ जिसका कि हाइजीनिक स्टैंडर्ड हमसे 100 गुना ज़्यादा है और इसी तरह से दक्षिण पूर्वी एशिया में उन्होंने जो मूलभूत चीज़ें हैं, तकरीबन उन्होंने प्राप्त कर लिया है। हमारे यहाँ मूलभूत चीज़ें जो हैं सिर्फ़ एक पर्टिकुलर क्लास के हाथ में है, बाकी ये जो मेजॉरिटी हैं उनको पता ही नहीं है क्या चीज़ है। तो ये एक बहुत बड़ा गैप है। तो उन्होंने बहुत अच्छी तरीके से कहा है कि जो हमारा धरोहर है, हमारा जो सांस्कृतिक धरोहर है दक्षिण पूर्वी एशिया में, म्यांमार को ही ले लें, तो हज़ारों पगोडास अभी भी साक्षात रूप से विद्यमान हैं, जो हमारे बृहद भारत को, हमारे भारत को लगातार ये कह रही है कि तुम कहाँ हो, तुम किस तरफ जा रहे हो, तुम्हारी संस्कृति कहाँ है और तुम्हारी संस्कृति को हम इस ढंग से सजे हुए हैं कि तुम आज हमसे कुछ सीख सकते हो। उसी तरह से लाओस में जाएं, कंबोडिया में जाएं, जिस ढंग से अंकोर वाट, जहाँ की शुरुआती तौर पे हिंदुइज़्म सनातन धर्म के ऊपर उनका सारा चीज़ आश्रित था, सारा चीज़ बेस्ड था। उसके बाद कैसे उन्होंने अपने आप को बुद्धिज़्म में अपने आप को ढाला और वो विश्व का सबसे बड़ा विष्णु टेम्पल हम उसको मान लें। और अभी भी इस ढंग से आप जाएंगे सुबह से लेकर के शाम तक भी आप पूरे मंदिर को आप घूम नहीं सकते, देख नहीं सकते हैं। एक पूरा टेम्पल श्राइन जो है, आप अपने आप को सिंपली धिक्कारेंगे जब आप ये कहेंगे कि हमारा जो विदेश नीति है वो किस तरह से हम ढाले हैं और उस विदेश नीति में इन सारी चीज़ों को, इसको कि हम कह सकते हैं मृदु शक्ति या सॉफ्ट पावर, इसको हम जो है इनकॉर्पोरेट नहीं किए हैं अभी तक। उसी तरह से वियतनाम में, सेंट्रल वियतनाम में जो डानांग म्यूज़ियम है, वहाँ पर जब आप जाएंगे तो शुरू से लेकर के अंत तक, इट्स स्टार्टिंग फ्रॉम द एंट्रांस टिल द एंड, यू विल फाइंड कि भारतवर्ष मौलिक रूप से यहीं पर है। थाईलैंड में सुखोताई, जहाँ भी जाएंगे आपको मिलेगा कि भारत मौलिक रूप से यहीं पर बसा हुआ है। सिंपली यू कैन फाइंड इट आउट, देयर आर मोर देन 500,000 monks, Buddhist monks in Myanmar. 500,000 Buddhist monks, equal numbers in Thailand, little lesser number in Indonesia. हमारी सरकार शुरू से लेकर के अभी तक इस चीज़ को, इस शक्ति को अपनी संज्ञान में नहीं लिया है। आप लोग, श्री संजय जी और सभी लोग जो काम कर रहे हैं, इसको मुहूर्त रूप देने के लिए बहुत सारी चीज़ें की ज़रूरत है। हमें तो लगता है कि कम से कम यदि बिहार के लोग और भी लोग ये इस बारे इसको जान जाएं कि हमारा जो बुद्धिज़्म है वो किस ढंग से हमारा एक अमूर्त सांस्कृतिक धरोहर है, और इससे हम ये नहीं कहते हैं कि लेट अस हैव कल्चरल टूरिज्म, रिलीजियस टूरिज्म, कैस्ट टूरिज्म। इस चीज़ से ऊपर हट करके इस चीज़ को हम अलाइन करें कि जापान के जो बुद्धिस्ट हैं या जापान के जो लोग हैं वो बोध गया में आएँगे, तो वो किस-किस चीज़ों को वो देखना पसंद करेंगे। लोग खाली भगवान बुद्ध का मंदिर और मूर्ति देखने के अलावा बहुत सारी चीज़ें देखते हैं, बहुत सारी चीज़ें नोट करते हैं। उसी तरह से इंडोनेशिया में, उधर दक्षिण पूर्वी एशिया में ऑलमोस्ट 200 बीसी से के साथ ही हिंदुइज़्म का वहाँ पे ऑलरेडी प्रचलन हो गया था। और उस समय में देखेंगे कि समसामयिक भारत में जो भारत की स्कॉलरशिप थी, जो नॉलेज परंपरा थी, वो अपने बहुत ही चरम सीमा पर थी, उत्थान पर थी। और इसका प्रभाव दक्षिण पूर्वी एशिया के सारे देशों में इतना इतना अधिक था, इतना अधिक था कि वहाँ की जब आप जो उनकी जो परंपरा है, उनकी जो संस्कृति है, उनकी जो धाराएँ हैं, बहुत तरह की धाराएँ हैं। धाराएँ मतलब जो उनका अभी भी बहुत सारे रिलीजन्स ऐसे हैं। इंडोनेशिया में ही सिर्फ 250 रिलीजन है, जिसको कि वहाँ की गवर्नमेंट मानती ही नहीं। और 250 धर्म में कम से कम तो 200 धर्म ऐसे हैं जो हमारे सनातन धर्म से डायरेक्टली जुड़ा हुआ है, सनातन धर्म या बुद्धिज़्म से। फिर हिंदुइज़्म बुद्धिज़्म से मिल कर के शैवाइट, बुद्धिस्ट शैवाइट धर्म वहाँ पे प्रचलित हुआ। तंत्र विद्या का वहाँ पे बहुत ज़्यादा क्या कहते हैं विकास हुआ। उसके बाद बहुत सारी चीज़ें हैं पढ़ने को, देखने को। मतलब मेरा कहने का मतलब ये है कि यदि आप भारत को संपूर्ण रूप से जानना चाहते हैं, तो दक्षिण पूर्वी एशिया का समसामयिक इतिहास, समसामयिक और अभी का वर्तमान संस्कृति, पहले का वर्तमान संस्कृति, मतलब वी नीड अ थॉरो रिसर्च हम अपने आप को समझने के लिए। और दूसरी चीज़, इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज़ मैं ये कहना चाहूँगा, बहुत सारे धरोहर ऐसे हैं पूरे दक्षिण पूर्वी एशिया में जो ख़त्म हो रहे हैं। अर्बनाइजेशन जो है सभी जगह पे हो रहा है, हमारे यहाँ भी हो रहा है, वहाँ पर भी हो रहा है। भारत से सटा हुआ एक तो हमारा म्यांमार है, वी शेयर बॉर्डर विथ म्यांमार। उसके बाद और म्यांमार के थ्रू हम थाईलैंड तक जा सकते हैं आराम से। उसके बाद इधर से दक्षिण से हम इंडोनेशिया का जो सुमात्रा आइलैंड है वो हम शेयर करते हैं वाटर बेस में, जो कि 100 नॉटिकल माइल्स दूर है। ये सुमात्रा के लैंड पर हम यदि जहाँ जाएंगे उसको कहते हैं सुबांग या बांदा आचे, सबांग आइलैंड है वहाँ पर, जिसके साथ हमारा अभी बहुत सारी चीज़ें भी चल रही है। सबांग पर जैसे ही जाएंगे तो वहाँ के लोग आपको आदर से पान खिलाएंगे और फिर आपको बहुत ही विनयपूर्वक लेकर के जाएंगे कि हमारे यहाँ एक मॉस्क है, आप वहाँ चलिए देखने के लिए। गया वहाँ पे तो मॉस्क में लिखा हुआ है कि ये पहले दुर्गा मंदिर था। वहाँ पे उनका अपना नाम है, शक्ति का नाम अलग नाम है, और पूरा सब कुछ लिखा हुआ कि किन राजाओं के द्वारा वो बनाया हुआ है। तो सिर्फ वहाँ की जितनी प्रशस्ति हैं, शिलालेख हैं, उस पर भी हमारे बहुत सारे रिसर्च हो जाएंगे। तो इन सारी धरोहर को संज्ञान में लेते हुए यदि कोई भी आप एक पाठ्यक्रम बनाना चाहते हैं, तो इन सारी चीज़ों को संज्ञान में लिया जाए और बहुत ही समग्र रूप से इसको समझना ज़रूरी है। तो उसको सब चीज़ को अलाइन करते हुए हम एक रूपरेखा तैयार करें तो हमारे लिए बहुत ही अच्छा रहेगा।
Bhagwan Buddha came from a landlocked Kapilvastu Lumbini to Gaya, and he attained the state of Tathagat. Gat means to move beyond. He moved beyond the worldly net of delusions. His vision for a beautiful, peaceful world continued to move beyond the borders of India. Today, I intend to place certain historical facts to rethink the fallacies regarding decline of Buddhism in India. While it is assumed unquestionably that Shankaracharya destroyed the Buddhist current with his power of tap and vimas, the history does not support such presuppositions. Because yoga and yogini tantras with humongous corpus that emerged only thereafter, and I will just add, there were two kind of tantra, like abridged version and mool tantra. So there were 2500 mool tantra, 1800 abridged tantra, that means 43, and each tantra had a corpus, had three different classifications: the sutta, thereafter the panjika, and then the commentary tika. So if we just multiply, it will be almost 1300,000 texts only on the Tantra which were composed after the demise of Shankaracharya ji. Thus, there is a parallel, and then there is a parallel narrative of Islamic invasion, sacking Buddhist monasteries and beheading the Sramana that caused the decline of Buddhism. We will see in the presentation that this is not tested against historical facts. The pinnacle of Nalanda was not during the journey of Xuanzang, but after Mahmud Ghazni's invasion. Again, Bakhtiyar Khilji is held responsible for sacking the Buddhist centers of learning like Nalanda, Odantapuri and Vikramshila sometime during the last decade of 12th century. Some people say in 1193, someone said in 1197 to 1203. But inscriptions and records both at Bodh Gaya, Korea and China showed that Buddhist masters continued to study at Nalanda as late 13th century, and they were held in the highest esteem across Asia. Aspandan, oscillation, that pervades everything in the cosmos. The structure also oscillates between growth and decline and renew with a fresh vigor. Buddhist institutions declined in the Magdan court sometime during the middle of 15th century due to manifold factors. Islamic rule was only one of those factors. We will see in the presentation. The decisive action undertaken by organizations like the Deskar Society to renew the dialogue with the centrality of Bodh Gaya is a part of this Asfaran. There is one, we say Aspandan. Asfaran is also expanding pulsation. So this is what Deskar is doing today. And I think a new cycle of resurgence of the Magdan core of Buddhism has begun. Let us see the expanding journey of Buddhism from Magdan core in a nutshell. The first Buddhist council was held at Rajgir just after Bhagavan Buddha's Mahaparinirvan. It was presided by the elder Mahakashyap. It is said that 84,000 words of Buddha were recorded through the Sangiti. The Vinyas were framed. During the second council, it was held to resolve dispute over certain monastic rules, and that was held in Vaisali. And I think there are several scholars from Vaisali today. Then third council was held under the leadership of Mogaliputta. It was held in Patliputra, and King Ashoka was the patron. It was in this council, third council, where it was decided to send missionaries to various countries to propagate Buddhism. And I am just showing there, from the initial phase, there were different kind of visions of propagating Buddhism. First was maritime vision as well as continental vision. So it's not that like what China claims, they have two different dimensions in their Silk Route. We have our Buddhist vision had from the very first day, from the third council, the two different visions. Prince Mahendra was sent to Ceylon, while missions were sent to Myanmar, Kashmir, Northwest India and beyond. We see similar pattern in dissemination of Vajrayana during 8th century, while Nalanda master like Subhagal Singha, Vajrabodhi along with Amog Vajra, they arrived at Tangkot in China sometimes in 720 AD through maritime route, touching Ceylon, Java and Canton, presently Guangdong. The land route was undertaken by Padmasambhav and Sant Rakshit to introduce Vajrayana in Tibet, Bhutan and so forth. Such was the missionary zeal after the third council that a stup and Ashokan pillars were erected as far as Nangchen in Qinghai Plateau of China. The stupa has been now restored in year 2015. Paralleling 84,000 sutras of the Sakyamuni Buddha, it is said that 84,000 Ashokan pillars were inscribed with Buddhist messages and erected. The zeal was renewed under the later Guptas, Harshvardhan and then the Pal rulers who were Buddhists. Dharmpal built Buddhist centers of learning in Sompura and Vikramshila. There was expert in composition of new texts. Such was the output of the Tantric literature that there was a crisis of doxography by 10th century. Only later cataloging outside India, both in China and Tibet, could overcome this crisis of classifying so much literature is there. And I am talking about this is 11th century. Let us see the Magdan core of Buddhism at the time of the raid by Mahmud Ghazni. The attack of Mahmud Ghazni on Somnath temple in 1025 AD was seen as a catastrophic event, but so was the attack by Rajendra Chol on Srivijaya Empire same year and just after a major solar eclipse of November 1025. So for them, it was like an eclipse. The Srivijaya Empire, that was our best, strongest Buddhist Hindu outposts in maritime Asia, and that was destroyed by our Cholas. Mahmud did not venture further east in the Magad. Why? Because by that time, earlier Magad was considered as the Madhya Desh. Fayan had been saying that Magad is a Zhongguo. But by the time of Mahmud, Mahmud brought Al-Biruni with himself, and Al-Biruni is saying Madhya Desh, Kannauj is Madhya Desh. So when Mahmud had already destroyed Kannauj in 1021 AD, so he did not think it fit to venture outside to the Purv Desh. And therefore Mahmud returned back after destroying Kannauj. Muslim scholars like Al-Biruni viewed Kannauj as the Madhya Desh and not Magad. It is little known that bilingual silver coins were also minted and issued under Mahmud Ghaznavi's name on the eve of the new 60-year Samvatsar cycle of Jupiter in 1026 and 1027 AD. And those coins, silver coins of Mahmud Ghaznavi, which were issued from Lahore, Mahmudpura, that had the Sanskrit inscription, Ab Vyaktang Ek Muhammad Avatar Nipati Mahmud. Unmanifest is one, Muhammad is his avatar, and Mahmud is the king. This was the Sanskrit inscription. So naturally, our own Hindu priests were with Al-Biruni and even Mahmud Ghaznavi, and giving them ideas to gain the legitimacy in Western India and Northwest India. But the Magdan Code, at the same time, when the new Jupiter cycle of 1027 begins, there is a longer Dihuri calendar in Indian tradition that is also followed by China, also Jiaji calendar, that 60-year cycle. So that began in 1027. Why it is important? Because Tibetans claim in 1027, year 1027, the new Kal Chakra calendar was introduced in Tibet. 1027 is very important for Buddhist history. It is in the same year when Indian Pandits were helping Mahmud to mint silver coins in Sanskrit inscriptions. Our Buddhist scholars in the Purv Desh, they were working to build up a consolidated synthetic philosophy, bringing all different streams of Hinduism and different 1500 years of Buddhist philosophy into one text. And that was the pinnacle of Indian Buddhism, Kal Chakra Tantra, because the writing of the Kal Chakra Tantra starts in 1027 AD. So we see there was, and that is the highest philosophy which has been produced by Buddhism, because that incorporates everything from Buddha time till 11th century, and not only I am saying philosophy, also technology, so many sciences. There are almost 80 subjects integrated into one text, and that too in sloka form. The Magdan Code, which was untouched by Mahmud's raid, that launched a major project of synthesizing Buddhist philosophy of 1600 years along with other Indian philosophy. In fact, they are also arguing for Semitic philosophy. They are also, because they tried to integrate the contemporary knowledge from different streams. Now we come here, 11th century Magad. What was happening in, now Mahmud Ghazni has gone back. The Buddhist masters have already launched major project of renewing Buddhism. And what is happening in Bodh Gaya at that time? Bodh Gaya was not only Vajrasan, as many have pointed out earlier, it was also considered as a Bodhi Mand, the place where future Buddha would be born. That was the reason that Burmese kings, Thai kings, everyone, they are sending pilgrims and missionaries to Bodh Gaya, because they wanted to renovate the temples, bring new monasteries. So Bodh Gaya is not only the Vajrasan where Sakyamuni Buddha attained enlightenment, it was also considered as the Bodhi Mand. In 1022 AD, Chinese monk In Sun is coming to Bodh Gaya. There is, Chinese inscriptions are available. Why it is important? Because now China had made In Sun in charge of the Lumbini temple, Chinese temple in Lumbini, and he is also the vice president of Buddhist Association of China. So one can see how China is now trying to appropriate Bodh Gaya, because monk In Sun is visiting Bodh Gaya in 1022 AD, and China had placed a monk In Sun's lineage, In Sun, in the forefront. Then in 1033 AD, Chinese embassies are erecting memorial stupa for the Song Emperor Taizong. Burmese kings are undertaking repair work of the Bodh Gaya temple. Very interesting. There is a place called Tangut, Chichia. So it was when the Song dynasty, so it had that it had not emerged powerful at that time. That kingdom existed, Liao and Chichia. So one Tangut monk, Sami Losava, he became the abbot of Bodh Gaya temple. So see the importance, and I'm talking about this is 1050 AD. Monks and pilgrims from many other, means when people are coming from Chichia and becoming abbot at Bodh Gaya, I'm talking about 11th century, middle of the 11th century. So there was not much impact of the Mahmud invasion on Bodh Gaya as a center for attracting. So by 11th century, middle of the 11th century, Bodh Gaya was already at the center of the Asian universe. Because at that time, Dipankar Adis, he's going to Swan he stayed there for 14 years. He comes back, then he go to Tibet. Sami Losava is coming from Chichia. Chinese are coming there. But what is surprising, that Al-Baruni did not mention at all about Bodh Gaya. In fact, he did not mention about much about Buddhism, and whatsoever he's mentioning, citing another earlier Persian writer, Iran Sahari. So this is the cultural mapping in the Kal Chakra Tantra. There are 48 pilgrim sites mentioned in the Kal Chakra Tantra. So that was composed during 11th century, middle of 1035, 37. The text was finally completed. And if you see, I've just calculated the latitude, longitude, and identified the 48 sites of the Kal Chakra corpus. So if you see the whole the identification of sacred sites, that goes up to the Central Java. So there are places from Thailand, there are places from Myanmar, there are places in Arakan, there are places. So it's the whole vision, if you see, and when I map, so there are 26 places which is only across the Bay of Bengal. So that means by middle of the 11th century, it was totally maritime the expansion of Buddhism. This is how I have mapped. I already discussed about Bakhtiyar Khilji, and there was not much effect of like on Buddhist institution in Magad, because after even Bakhtiyar Khilji's invasion, if we see, we have account of Dharma Swami who visited Magad between 1234 and 1236, and he is saying that monks are living at Nalanda, and that remained a thriving center. Then we know there is one Dhyan Bhadra who was a great monk who went to Korea as well as China, Qigong. So he was one of the major figure of 14th century Chinese Buddhism. He was born in Magad and he studied in Nalanda. How we know? Because there is a still inscription in Korea containing all his biography. So if he studied in Nalanda for 11 years, I am talking about late 13th century, that means Nalanda remained active. So there is not only one account from Tibetan Dharma Swami. Then we know there was one Pandit Sahar Sri. He went to China, to the Ming court. There is Sariputla is the last abbot who went to China in 1421 AD at the time when the new emperor, Ming Emperor Yongle, he was undertaking residence in the Forbidden City, which was built in 1420. So we see that there is Chinese mission is coming in 1378 to 1382 AD to Bodh Gaya, Sungle expedition. How did it decline? Because I have account that by middle of the 15th century also, people are coming to Magad and getting scribes to copy the text for distribution, because that was considered to be a dharmic activity. But by middle of 15th century, the movable type printing technology came. So there was not much demand for the scribes to write. So that was one of the major factors of declining importance. Second thing was like in China or Korea, Confucianism was adopted as an official ideology. In Japan, that went into turbulence. In India, Islamic rule came. So it is almost in the middle of the 15th century that importance of Magad is declining. But again, sometimes next, I will show how by 1560s, again its importance is gaining, but there are no more Buddhists who are going to China. It is the Gosais who claim they are the Hindu monks only, but claiming we are Buddhists, and they are accorded or treated as Acharya Lamas across China, even during the Ming and later Qing Empire. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Skull Society and IGNCA and ICWA, Ministry of Culture, NTPC for giving me this opportunity to be the part of third Global Dialogue 2020. So the first session and the theme of this first session is fostering the relations between India and Southeast Asian countries with reference to the rising role of Buddhism in India's soft power and Bodh Gaya. So relating to this theme, basically my paper reflects on religious tourism as India's soft power, unfolds cultural and religious connections with Thailand. So, because it is, I'm taking complete the topic to the different dimension, and when we are talking about religious tourism, definitely to some extent it is going to be attached with Buddhism, of course. And when I'm talking about India, Thailand, and of course Bodh Gaya attached with it, it means that somewhere to or other that Buddhism concept is also connected with it. So the purpose to project this paper is basically to show the blend of these cultural and religious connections between India and Thailand, which uh, which which could be carried forward with the help of religious tourism. And the use of culture as a tourist attraction increases support for India and as well as Thailand, which also displays their ethnic identity, revitalization of tradition, language, arts, and festivals. So, tourism development creates cultural and religious impact on both the countries, and it is also the transformation of economic and social structure as well as the social values, which results in minimizing of social inequity and improves the standard of living of residents. So, India, with Southeast Asian countries in particular, derives its soft power from a shared culture that has been nurtured over the period. And of course, the course of more than 2 millennia, I can say, and Buddhism is a part of this historic engagement. And there is a constant flow of pilgrims from the Southeast Asian countries to India even today. So the paper basically examines the role of religious tourism in India's soft power projection in unveiling and analyzing cultural and religious connections with Buddhist sites of Thailand and Buddhist uh, heritage trails in India. So it's India, I'm talking as a whole because in India, UP is also there where you can find the Buddhist sites. And in Bodh Gaya, of course, there are many. And in fact, in Bihar itself, you have many other places where you can find Buddhist circuits, in fact. So it reviews government initiatives, both national and international, and towards promoting, in fact, Buddhist circuits. Definition of power, of course, when we'll talk about definition of power, then it comes hard power and soft power, and of course, smarter power also. And later, the connection of India Thailand connection with the cultural and religious connection, how it is connected. So, first of all, I'll start with the concept that is tourism, and which is known to be the world's largest industry. It's an important vehicle for economic and socio-cultural and religious development, which provides maximum numbers of employment. It not only generates foreign exchange earnings, but also stimulates cultural linkages, exchanges of the host and the guest countries that spread from India and other countries. Buddhism has the maximum potential for attracting tourists from abroad. So, this is because while born in India, Buddhism has most of its adherents outside the country's borders. It is almost 97.23% of the world's Buddhists are concentrated in East and Southeast Asia. So, religious tourism in India has been identified as holding great promise. And so, India is currently home of 7 of the 8 most significant Buddhist sites in the world. It receives less than 1% of global Buddhist tourism, and that we need, of course, need to work on it. Why the flow of tourists are so less? Because there are many significant Buddhist sites in the country. So, Southeast Asian nations such as Thailand and Indonesia are the prime recipients of such tourism. So, in the morning, also, we were discussing that there are many other things why people don't want to come to Bodh Gaya. Of course, we need to think about many other things like cleanliness and infrastructure, of course. You need to give some facilities to the tourists so that they can come again and again. When we talk about the tourism and soft power, so the tourism plays an important role in exchange, enhancing a country's soft power in some sense. It connects people and places and immerses visitors in other countries and other cultures as well. It also helps communicate cultural and governance attributes that make a country admirable. The success of inbound tourism is often seen as a key measurement of nations' soft power, and international rankings based on soft power tend to use tourism as one of their measures. According to Joseph Nye, the term is basically he talked about hard power and soft power both, and the hard power, he said, the ability to use the carrots and sticks of economic and military might to make other follow your will. And he basically talks that hard power is also as a command power, so where basically you need to command most of the time in the military thing, we need hard power. We come to the soft power here that, according to Joseph Nye, you can say, is to describe the ability to attract and co opt rather than coerce. Such force of give money as a means of persuasion. Soft power is the ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction. So, this is very important to know. Where we are talking about appeal and attraction, then definitely tourism, so religious tourism, is to some extent is appealing and it is attracting, of course. Defining feature of soft power is that it is non-coercive. The currency of soft power is culture, political values, and foreign policies. So when we are talking about culture, then how I am linking, how I'm connecting India and Thailand as a cultural linkages and religious linkages. So that to some extent gives a political values, and of course it is going to be a foreign policies will be helping towards the foreign policies as well. Recently, the term has been used in changing and influencing social and public opinion through relatively less transparent channels and lobbying through powerful political and non-political organization, and raising its importance more than a hard power. We can see in the graph that how this soft power, when it was in a very slanting way, and it is going high now. Now, we most of the countries using this particular soft power where to attract people in that sense, and to appeal and attraction is main concept of this thing. We can see here it has Joseph Nye has talked about culture here and how we can, I'm just given a figure just to make an, and here why I have given this incredible India, because when we are talking about tourism, then we can see that how food, culture, heritage, your costumes, your language, and many things are being, it's very important. In fact, religion is also one important thing where need to be noticeable and need to be, this is exchanged from both where the guest and host countries among them. So now I'm going to connect that India and Thailand connections with the cultural and religious connections I'm talking about here. So people to people ties between Thailand and India have existed for several centuries. References are found in ancient Indian literature about Thailand as Suvarna Bhumi or the Golden Land. In 329 BC, Emperor Ashok sent Sona and Uttara to Suvarna Bhumi to spread the message of Buddhism. The shared link of Buddhism is reflected in the regular pilgrimages to the places of Buddhist interest in India by Thais. So, to some extent, when we are connecting this religious tourism here, of course, we need this particular sense in our mind that how particular Buddhism is connected to both the country, how it is the main passage, or you can say it's a link where the cultural and religious connection can be identified. So, the religion and cultural impact has been so deep and inspiring that can be noticed in the architecture and sculpture of the country. Architect in Thailand also we can see it is almost similar to what India has. And the festivals also, it's a similar. I'm not going in detail. Even the dances, most of the dances are similar. One of the dance, Kshatriya dance is one where it is basically it is a dance and drama, which the theme is played related to Krishna and Radha. So these are the connection, religious connections, and the cultural connection, I could say, is connecting India and Thailand. Even when one point is Brahmanism is also one connection that has been taken from India only to Thailand. So the connection between two countries could be traced with the recent example set by Northeast India, who celebrated a mega Northeast India festival comprising of trade, tourism, culture, and academics and fashion in Bangkok. And the tagline for the festival was connecting Northeast India to Southeast Asia. The highlights of the Northeast India Festival in Bangkok aimed at increasing bilateral trade and tourism. So, how the Thailand tourist arrival in India, we can say sometimes it goes down and goes up. So that is very important to know why it is. I mean, ups and downs are there. We need to cover those gaps at least. Now I'm coming to the government initiative that what government has had to do. The first Thai monastery outside Thailand built by the Thai government on invitation of Indian government in Gaya has been one of the major tourist destination for Thai people. So we can see how it is related to religious tourism. And with this initiative in 2010, over 600,000, I mean, it is like 6 lakhs Indian tourists travel to Thailand. So, on the other hand, the number of Thai tourists to India is gradually increasing, mostly to visit significant Buddhist sites in India. So, it's very important. And other thing is to boost the relations and tourism in bid to attract more tourists from Thailand. Our present Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, announced that India will facilitate double entry e-tourist visas for Thai citizens. So this is also where the flow of tourists can come, and most of the monks who can visit to the Buddhist place is very easy nowadays. So there are one more important is India Myanmar trilateral highway has also been trying to build to make people easy to commute. In fact, those who can't commute through via plane, they can commute through via road. So the fourth is Make in India initiative in tourism, where it is important. Only 1 minute. Promotion of Buddhist circuit, infrastructure, cleanliness, manufacturing sector, hospitality facilities. These all are really very important when we need to connect India and Thailand and Bodh Gaya, of course. These all things are very important.
Here, the historical part of Buddhism in Myanmar. Let's see it in detail. The first inhabitants of Myanmar belonged probably to Austro-Asiatic group, but they had no left perceivable traces. They were replaced by Tibetan Burman tribes who came from eastern Tibet in the beginning of the Christian era. The oldest of them, known by name, were the Peus and the Kanran and the Arakanese and the Thet, who may be the ancestors of the Chen. Other ethnic groups were Talingas, Mon in the southeast of the country, and the Karens in the east. The Shans appeared much later in the 10th century. According to the Myanmar belief, Buddhism arrived into the country soon after Siddhartha Gautam, the founder of this religion, was enlightened and became Buddha. The story tells of two merchant brothers from Lower Burma who went on journey to pay homage to Buddha and received 8 strands of his hair venerate. The merchants were the first lay of followers of the Buddha and the first people who took refuge in him, the Dhamma, his teachings. Before the Sangha, the community of monks began to exist. However, before the Theravada school, Theravada is one of the way of Buddhism, one of the South Indian school in Buddhism came into existence as the religion of the court and spread into influence over the people, and there existed different school of Buddhism. While as in Myanmar, the Theravada Buddhism is not a totalizing influence on Burmese politics. The religion has provided both a set of ideational raw material and a general conceptual framework within which most of the Buddhists in Myanmar think about and practices politics. Within this framework, Burmese Buddhists have developed a wide range of interpretations of basic Buddhist ideas and often combined with political ideology from other sources. Burmese political thinkers have used Buddhist principle to both defend and contest political authority and to construct a national identity in which the state and religion for many both independent and are inseparable. Monks have played really a leading role in Myanmar politics, justified via their responsibility to defend and propagate the religion as well as their obligation to reduce sufferings. Monks and the lay people across the political spectrum have also developed conceptions of democracy that make reference to Buddhism in actually prioritizing different elements of the religion, and this conception result in contrasting democratic visions. The appropriate relationship between Buddhism and politics remains an essentially contested question within Buddhist communities. In Myanmar, the tradition of Buddhist political thought has sporadically developed due to large part of almost 5 decades of restrictive military rule. However, the political reforms since 2011 more paced has upon open up for the political participation, revealing a wide range of opinion regarding the relevance of Buddhist teachings to politics and relationship of Buddhist identity to Burmese national identity. Here we see how the relationship between monks and the politics. While the monastic vocation is generally one of the renunciation and detachment, the practice of taking robes and vows varies widely across Buddhist communities. In contrast with Sri Lanka, a Theravada Buddhist country where monks have played a direct and active role in politics, even to the degree of forming monastic political parties and running for the parliament, Burmese popular custom generally prohibits monastic political participation. However, monastic engagements in politics, some form or the other, has been the feature of Myanmar religious political life since at least early stages of the colonial period. Monks have supported the state, used their moral authority to chastise the political leaders, and even joined in the protests opposing the state, such as those in 1998 and 2007. The moral standing of monks come from their detachment from the worldly concerns, including politics, and a presumed lack of self-interested motivations. The Burmese Sangha, the monkhood, has a long tradition of social and political engagement, with monks justifying their action either with reference to their vocational role as defender and propagator of Buddhism or as an obligation of reducing suffering in the world. Now, how this Buddhism has turned into a Buddhist nationalism. So, one aspect of Burmese Buddhist politics that has appeared since 2012, which was a resurgence of the monk-led Buddhist nationalism, directed primarily against Muslims and resulting into riots and violence across the country. This is not a new phenomena. With the anti-Indian and anti-Muslim riots have taken place early, but now, like with the policies of successive military government, has repressed non-Buddhist religious practices, especially in the ethnic minority region. Now, majorly in the early 2014, a new lay monastic organization that has formed the Organization of Protection of Race and Religion, the MABTA in the Burmese acronym. These are playing a role in the nationalist argument, which is getting strengthened. But now, attaching Buddhism with the democracy. The relationship between Buddhism and democracy has been a regular subject to political discussion in Myanmar, at least since the late 19th century. With the country's current political transition and a Buddhist majority, interestingly, seeking to both protect itself and assert its dominance, the question will likely remain central in years to come. However, even though some common threads in the discourse can be identified as a range of ways in which Buddhists in Myanmar understand democracy, the right-based democracy, as Aung San Suu Kyi usually discusses democracy in the way that is consistent with Western liberal democracy, where human rights, free and fair elections, and other freedom figures predominantly in her speeches is seen. Seeking to contest the claim of former military government that democracy was not appropriate for the Burmese population. She has insisted that Buddhism and democracy are compatible, and since the former is an integrated social and ideological system based on the respect of the individual, and later the Buddhism is the democracy is the places where the greatest value of on man. Now, Buddhism also gives a concept called moral democracy, which is actually compatible with wide range of political and economic ideologies. As we have already discussed the concept of soft power, because how India is engaging into Southeast Asia is through the soft power strategy. Basically, this concept was formulated by Joseph Nye in 1990, and he defined it as that when one country gets into the countries to do what it wants and as cooperative power. And he says that today the definition of power is losing its emphasis on military force. The factor of technology, education, and economic growth are becoming more significant in international relations. And actually, he also describes the determinants, which basically plays important role. And he says that this concept of soft power is very much relative in terms of when we talk in the traction of foreign policy discussions. And why Buddhism as a soft power? So, Buddhism's potential utility in foreign policy is derived to a large extent from the manner in which the faith was revived and in the aftermath of the Second World War. The revival of the faith and a decidedly internationalist outlook to it and focus on transgressing the sectarian and geographical boundaries. This was facilitated by the foundation of the member of organizations and the convening of the numerous conferences in the decades after the war, and emphasized on traditional cooperation amongst various set of Buddhism. So why India actually is taking a lead? Because despite the fact that it is a host to a relative small population of Buddhists in terms of proportion, India is in a position to claim legitimacy in the promotion of Buddhist diplomacy for a number of reasons. Like the first is Buddhist faith originated in India, therefore granting it singular historical legitimacy. Second, India has numerous sites of importance to Buddhist faith, such as Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, and Alanda. Third, India has nurtured an image of being a protector of the persecuted because of the presence of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan parliament in exile in the city of Dharamshala following the failed insurrection against the China. Successfully seeing these associations, we can see that we have a deepening ties with Asian nations on the basis of Buddhism, which could potentially feed into larger policy objectives of the government, namely the neighborhood first policy or the Act East policy, in which the Southeast Asian countries are basically taken up. And India-Myanmar relations has gained more important after this Act East policy, which was done by our Prime Minister Narendra Modi during 2014 ASEAN Summit, and towards looking east became a whole concept of the Southeast Asian politics or the foreign policy. Here, the regular visits between both sides is in 2016, the Aung San Suu Kyi visited India, PM Modi visited in Myanmar in 2017. So the president in February 2020 visited India. So many developments taking place, and the joint statement mentioned. I mean, some of the major MOUs were signed in this 2020, and economic diplomacy is also where the Myanmar is looking for, apart from China, towards India. So here, India is also investing in Rakhine as it occupies a unique location to India. And the Sitwe port, which is a part of Kaladan multi-model project, lies in Rakhine, and the port will aid in the trade between India and Myanmar. Thus, the soft power diplomacy will play a major role in India-Myanmar ties, will act as a crucial pillars in the engagements of both the countries. Thank you.
I must clarify, hard power generally consists of two elements. It's either economic or military. Any other culture influences is called soft power. The present context where we are talking about soft power in Southeast Asian countries context, actually all these Southeast Asian and East Asian countries were very much oriented towards India from since time immemorial. With most of these countries, we had very good trade and commerce relations, and naturally with that we had religious ties, ethnic ties, everything. But in due course of time, these ties got somewhere withered away because we started looking at them from a colonial perspective. Because for them, our immediate neighbor became a distant neighbor. We started seeing them as as Southeast Asia as others. Like it was a completely different orientation given to these countries. But still, for us, it was like it's their immediate neighbor, and that's already been described by Dr. Sneha and Dr. Anuja in their presentation, how we can, what were the elements of the connections between these two countries and where we can modify these. But I'm just going to give a few elements how why Buddhism flourished in these countries, because Buddhism is a religion which patronized trade and commerce at that time, and that's why you'll see all the Buddhist monastery which developed, they were mostly on the trade routes, and that was one of the major reasons why these Buddhism got promoted in all these Southeast and East Asian countries. And since they used to patronize it, they used to go with these merchant class to these countries, where they ultimately settled down, brought down Indian thoughts and culture, which again we need to revive in the present times, because presently we have almost, as I just said earlier, we got disconnected somewhere in the colonial time, and which we need to revive considering our present situation, because where we have on the one side ascending China, which is asserting itself, it's not only militarily and economically but even cultural, in culture sector. So there we need to revive Indian old glory, and we need to revive ties with all the countries where we have had a presence, somewhere presence. And since our country was mostly attacked by some power or the other, since our country remained subjugated to colonial power for a very long time, since almost 1,000 years uh, since the establishment of Delhi Sultanate. So we have lost many things in between. And but in some of these countries, as Dr. Jha was even saying, that so these countries still have some of the original elements which they took from India, which we can again revive. So if we can establish something of that sort, that would be great. We need to go to these countries. We definitely need to read their scriptures, epigraphy, and all other inscriptions and books, whatever we can get there. So then only we can revive our old traditions and culture. It has to be mentioned here that there is no dearth of interest in those countries for visiting India. Only thing they lack obviously is like the infrastructure part, because the lack of security, lack of hotels and others, as Sir had even said in the morning. Because of that, there in my personal visit to some of the countries, I have talked to few people, and they consider India as it's a god country. They have that much reverence for India, but still they don't want to visit India just because of lack of security. So these things need to be obviously any organization cannot take initiative in these regards. For these, the obviously government will have to take some measures. But still, as an organization, what Deshkal Society can do is at least provide a platform where all the knowledge it can provide, the knowledge, it can become a knowledge center where it can provide all the materials for any good research, or all the available information on the earth can be put at one place. So I think that would be that will do a good human service to the society. Thank you.
See, one of the most important aspects in this area is which are the places which are generating maximum remittance and revenues through culture tourism or through tourism. we can learn from Bali and also from Thailand. See, Bali has thousands of temples, mostly Hindu temples, and majority of the tourists, 99% tourists who flock across the globe to Bali, वहाँ पर वो लोग सिर्फ वहाँ की जो बीच हैं, वहाँ के जो समुद्री तट है या वहाँ के पहाड़ हैं, वहाँ पर नहीं आते हैं घूमने के लिए। उनका जो बेसिक पर्पस होता है, सर्वे से पता चला है कि वहाँ पे वो लोग अपना जो स्पिरिचुअल सॉलेस है, वहाँ पे हज़ारों योगा सेंटर हैं, मंदिर में जाते हैं और मंदिर का अपना एक डेकोरम है, वो वहाँ पर उनको अपना कपड़ा पहनवाते हैं, फिर अंदर जाते हैं। फिर वहाँ पे जो मंदिर का है, वहाँ मंदिर के अंदर में मूर्ति नहीं होता है, मूर्ति बाहर में होता है। और वहाँ के जो आम जनता है, जो लोग टूरिस्ट सेक्टर से डायरेक्टली और इनडायरेक्टली जुड़े हुए हैं, दे आर ऑल educated not in terms of they have gone to school and college and university, they have educated regarding the tourism। कि हम लोग कहते हैं कि अतिथि देवो भव सिर्फ हमारे फॉर्मूला में है, सिर्फ हमारे विचार में है। जहाँ तक कि प्रैक्टिकलिटी की बात है, वो अतिथि देवो भव जो है वो नगण्य हो जाता है जब हम टैरिफ की बात करते हैं, सर्विस की बात करते हैं। सर्विस सेक्टर में हमें लगता है कि थाईलैंड, इंडोनेशिया, यहाँ से हमें सीखना चाहिए। अतिथि का कैसे सत्कार करते हैं वहाँ सीखना चाहिए। और यदि ट्रॉपिकल कंट्री होते हुए भी आप जब जाएंगे वहाँ पे, तो मंदिर जो होटल्स वगैरह सब हैं, उनके आगे में आपको एक दीप जलता हुआ मिलेगा, कुछ फल मिलेंगे, कुछ फूल मिलेंगे। तो वो उनका जो मतलब आप बोलते हैं ना वेलकम, यहाँ हम लोग सिर्फ जो बाराती होते हैं उनका वेलकम करते हैं। तो जो वहाँ पर वेलकम करते हैं टूरिस्ट को, जब वो आते हैं तो अनायास ही यदि उनको 2 दिन वहाँ का प्रोग्राम है तो वो चाहेंगे कि हम वहाँ पे 5 दिन 6 दिन रह जाएं। और सर्वे से पता चला है कि पूरे दुनिया में जितना भी टूरिस्ट बाहर में रहते हैं, मैक्सिमम टाइम वो लोग बाली में रहते हैं। एक टूरिस्ट का उनका है कि 6 से 7 दिन के अंदर में $1000 खर्चा करते हैं। तो इन सारी चीज़ों से हमें कम्युनिटी को जो उससे डायरेक्टली और इनडायरेक्टली रिलेटेड है, उन्हें एजुकेट करना पड़ेगा। जो हमारे अतिथि हैं वो क्या चाहते हैं, उनको क्या चाहिए, तो फल की इच्छा ना करते हुए यदि हम इस चीज़ पर ध्यान दें तो अनायास ही हमारे सारी चीज़ें जो हमारी समस्याएं हैं, जो इमीडिएट नीड है, वो जो है पूरी हो जाएगी। इन सभी के साथ आज का चर्चा हमारा बहुत ही सुंदर रहा। तो इस पूरे सत्र का आज अभी यहीं समापन कर दिया जाए।